I'm Alasdair Young. I'm a professor and the Neil Family Chair in the Staunton School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology, and I'm co-director of our Center for European and Transatlantic Studies. Welcome to our panel discussion on the Brexit and the disunited kingdom. I'm delighted to have an excellent panel made up of scholars based in each of the devolved regions who will be answering my questions. Then Andrew Staunton, the British Consul General in Atlanta, will comment before I open up questions from the audience. Before we turn to the substance of our discussion, there are some administrative matters to address. The Center for European and Transatlantic Studies is a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and is supported by a grant from the EU under its Erasmus Plus program. We are grateful for the support, but nothing said during this session, no matter how insightful, can be attributed to the EU. This event is also supported by the Jean Monnet in the USA network, composed of EU studies centers across the United States. If you have questions, please ask them using the Q&A function to the right of your screen. Please keep them short. Now, the first week of May witnessed the 100th anniversary of the Partition of Ireland, the change of government leadership in Northern Ireland, local and regional elections in the UK, including parliamentary elections in Scotland and Wales. Brexit, the UK's departure from the European Union, has affected the politics within the regions and created new tensions between the devolved governments and the UK government in London. Recall that in a referendum in 2016, a majority of people in the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, but majorities in Northern Ireland and Scotland voted in favour of remaining. The UK formally left the EU at the end of January 2020, after nearly 50 years of membership. The transition period, during which the UK remained within the EU's rules, while a new relationship between the UK and the EU was negotiated, ended at the end of last year. The agreement that replaced EU membership is a pretty bare-bones free trade agreement, which has entailed, among other things, a sharp change in the trading relationship between Great Britain and the EU. The recently revealed implications of Brexit have roiled the politics in the region. Now, to explain a bit of the background, the UK is a unitary state, but the central government has devolved powers to the principal regions of Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. The major devolution step came under Tony Blair's Labour government in 1998. Devolution for Scotland and Wales reflected political calculations of the Labour government and followed referenda. Devolution for Northern Ireland was agreed as part of the Good Friday Agreement, which brought an end to the sectarian violence euphemistically known as the Troubles. Not only are the origin stories different, but the devolved arrangements are different for each region, with Northern Ireland and Scotland having more self-government than Wales. Now, Brexit has disturbed the relatively settled constitutional order because the UK reclaimed powers that had been delegated to the EU, raising the question as to which level of government they should be allocated. To shed light on these issues, I'm delighted to be joined by our excellent panel, Megan Dee, a lecturer in international politics at the University of Stirling in Scotland, David Phinnemore, professor of European politics at Queen University Belfast in Northern Ireland, and Richard Wynne-Jones, director of the Wales Governance Centre and Dean of Public Affairs at Cardiff University in Wales. As I mentioned earlier, Andrew Staunton, the British Consul General in Atlanta, will comment before I open up the questions from the audience. I've asked the participants to keep their comments brief in order to leave plenty of time for questions from the audience, but there is a great deal to cover. So without further ado, turning first to Megan. Megan, how has Brexit affected the politics in Scotland?
Thank you, Alasdair. Thank you, everybody, as well. I'm speaking to you from just outside Stirling in the central belt of Scotland. As Alasdair attested, we recently had a Scottish election, parliamentary election, just over a week ago. I think that question is a huge question. How has Brexit affected the politics in Scotland? As background to this, we really need to recognise that obviously in 2014, we were already seeing fault lines appear amongst the Scottish electorate with regards to the big question mark of Scottish independence. So we had a referendum here in Scotland, which was then followed 2 years later by the Brexit referendum. Now let's go back to that 2014 point. So 2014, we had in Scotland the highest electoral turnout ever recorded in Scotland. 85% of voters turned out to vote for the question, should Scotland be independent of the UK? Now, that vote secured a 55% in favour of no, essentially. So the no camp won. No, Scotland should not be independent of the UK. And so many in that camp breathed a sigh of relief, thinking, okay, life continues as normal. 2 years later, David Cameron calls the Brexit referendum. And in 2016, we're therefore faced with another referendum here in Scotland, asking whether or not the Scottish people wanted to, as with the rest of the UK, wanted to remain or leave the European Union. Now, so in Scotland, we have this polarisation already at play. You're either a yes voter or a no voter. Since 2016, you're also a remain voter or a leave voter. And really what was significant about Brexit, and which has really impacted the politics of Scotland, is that 62% of voters in the Brexit referendum voted to remain within the European Union. Now, whilst the UK as a whole saw the Leave camp essentially win, if you will, they got 52% of the overall vote, and therefore beginning the process that saw the invocation of Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty and the subsequent saga, as we all, I'm sure some of you will have been following, that saw the UK withdraw from the European Union. Those 62% of Scottish voters, that's around 1.6 million voters, felt unsurprisingly slightly peeved. This was not what we voted for. Brexit seemed, to the Scottish people at least, to have gone against their will. Now, the result of that Brexit referendum has been an increasing movement, and in ever more shrill tones, admittedly, for a second independence referendum, or Indie Ref 2, as we tweet about, because it's too long to say independent referendum. Now, despite the fact that 2014 was being sort of sold, the 2014 referendum was being sold as a once-in-a-lifetime referendum where the Scottish people would have their voice heard, Brexit created a new opportunity. Because 62% of voters didn't want to withdraw from the EU, the SNP saw this as another, essentially going against the will of the Scottish people, and therefore have been pushing for the second referendum that would call for another independence referendum from the rest of the UK. Also seen as a result of this, an increasing move by those voters who voted to remain in the EU, moving towards Scottish independence themselves. So the SNP have seen a bolstering of support by those Remain voters. Equally, we've also seen, slightly smaller admittedly, but a number of Leave voters increasingly voting for pro-union parties such as the Scottish Conservatives. The result of that is that we're seeing, as we saw in the Scottish elections just over a week ago, is an electoral map that is fundamentally dominated still by the SNP, who won 64 of the 129 Scottish Parliament seats, but also significant evidence of tactical voting by pro-union voters who voted for Conservatives and Labour on the regional list, and which is actually therefore seen as sort of fairly even matching between pro-independence and pro-union parties in the Scottish Parliament. What I would say, therefore, is that Brexit has ultimately exacerbated an already sort of broiling pot of discontent between independence supporters and unionists. And at this moment, what we find ourselves with is a country essentially divided straight down the middle in a near 50-50 split between those who want an independent Scotland and those who want to remain within the UK. Now, the consequence is actually going to likely be constitutional stalemate. I don't think we're going to see second independence referendum anytime soon, although Nicola Sturgeon, who is the leader of the SNP, has already signalled to Boris Johnson that it's a matter of when, not if, that there will be a second referendum, and those close to the First Minister are saying that it's likely to be before the end of 2023. But either way, it is a risky moment to be doing anything, not least because everything is at this point really geared towards COVID and COVID recovery, but also because Scotland is so divided straight down the middle in a near 50-50 split that actually if a referendum were called right now, not necessarily guaranteed that independence would be secured. If it does happen, and we do get an Indy Ref 2, as they're calling it, I can fully expect that the question of the European Union is going to be front and centre in that campaign. The EU, this whole idea of remain or leave, is a really key part of the question mark over whether Scotland should be independent or not. And for the SNP particularly, this is going to be a very easy task, because they have always said if Scotland was to become an independent country, they would be seeking for Scotland to rejoin the European Union. The pro-union parties, such as the Conservatives, Labour, and even the Lib Dems, might have a slightly harder time of it. They want to remain in the UK, and yet many of them are also very much pro-EU as well. So there's going to be a bit of a dividing line there. For now, though, we're in this sort of constitutional stalemate where we have a fairly even split between the two sides, and I would say Brexit has been very much a part of that tension and the discontent that's been brewing.
Great, thank you, Megan, very much. So, David, I don't think Brexit's had much of an impact on Northern Ireland, has it?
I'd like to say it's had very little impact, but I think picking up on some of the themes that Megan just noted, yeah, huge number of tensions around and highly disruptive. I think by way of background, point out to everybody that Northern Ireland comes from a particular past. We had the Troubles in the 70s, 80s and 90s. We had the peace process launched in 1998. And for the next 15 years, great efforts were placed on trying to establish and maintain a power sharing set of arrangements in Northern Ireland, whereby you brought together those who would identify as British and those who would identify as Irish in a way to manage a devolved Northern Ireland. It was always a fragile process. It was always unsettled, but I think we got to the point where we thought things were beginning to work quite well in 2016. And then we got the referendum. I think it's fair to say no one really thought through the implications of a leave vote in the referendum for Northern Ireland, but it came, and suddenly people began to realise that there were quite significant challenges around leaving the EU. And moreover, the differences of opinion within Northern Ireland, which, although we did have a majority voting for the United Kingdom to stay in the EU, it wasn't as big as the majority in Scotland. And many of those who would identify as British, as Unionist, were quite keen on the UK to leave, whereas essentially those who would identify as nationalist, Irish, wanted very much for the UK to stay in the EU. Initially, I think there was a sense that, okay, well, there was a set of Northern Ireland particular issues which needed to be addressed in the context of leaving the EU. And the most obvious one was the whole question of the land border. I think it's always interesting following debates in the UK about the extent to which it is a united kingdom, and that in some respects that it is essentially an island nation. We often see that rhetoric. A lot of people tend to forget that the UK does have land borders. Not only that, it has quite a lengthy one in Ireland, 499 kilometres, and one of the most contested borders in contemporary Europe. No one had really paid attention to what would happen at that border if and when the UK left the EU, and particularly if it left the customs union and the single market of the EU. During 2016-17, there were efforts to try and identify a sort of common position by the Northern Ireland executive, but unfortunately our executive collapsed. Power sharing collapsed in early 2017. And thereafter, those who identify as Irish nationalists, those who identify as British Unionists, basically started taking quite different positions on what should happen with regards to Brexit. And so you saw them moving apart rather than trying to sort of cooperate together, try and find a way forward for Northern Ireland. And these divisions which have existed within Northern Ireland have just persisted throughout the Brexit process. And we see them really today around the whole question of what's referred to as the protocol. Under the terms of withdrawal, particular arrangements were put in place whereby Northern Ireland is treated differently to the rest of the United Kingdom in the Brexit process. And while this is broadly welcomed by many nationalists, because one of the effects of this is we avoid a land border on the island of Ireland, really important for many people who identify as Irish and nationalist. The corollary of that is that we've got a new, what's referred to as an Irish sea border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, so within the United Kingdom. And for those who identify as British Unionists, this is a real concern for them, because Northern Ireland is being treated quite radically differently, at least in terms of movement of goods, in terms of trade, than the rest of the United Kingdom. And they really genuinely fear for the future of Northern Ireland and its position in the United Kingdom. So there's big differences of opinion over the arrangements that are in place for Brexit. Moreover, what this has done has triggered or led to increased discussion about Irish unity, because one of the key things that we've seen in this whole process is in many respects a disregard for the interests of Northern Ireland in the process. And this has led to many nationalists seeing their trust in the UK government just decrease, and has pushed more to support the idea of Irish unification. That said, we're still not anywhere near seeing a majority in favour of a united Ireland. The situation is different here in Northern Ireland compared to Scotland, because under the 1998 Good Friday Belfast Agreement, if there is a majority, according to opinion polls, then the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, the government minister responsible for Northern Ireland, is essentially obliged to call a border poll, a poll on whether there should be Irish unity. We're not there yet, but the consequence of Brexit is that we've got a more intense debate and discussion around the whole question of Irish unity, such that the majority opinion is that we will have a border poll at some point in the next 10 years. And the significance of this is that this really increases those concerns amongst unionists about the position of Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom, particularly painful for them when we're marking the 100th anniversary of the existence of Northern Ireland. I've certainly heard one or two unionist politicians basically ask the question, what have we got to celebrate this year? Because there's a sense, in some quarters at least, that we're possibly on the route towards Irish unity at some point in the future. And Brexit has been an important catalyst for this. So we've moved from a situation in 2016 where very few people were really thinking about the implications of Brexit for Northern Ireland, to the situation now, 2021, where Northern Ireland is being treated very differently from the rest of the United Kingdom. And the whole question of the constitutional future of Northern Ireland is very much on the agenda.
Hey, David, thank you very much. Now, Richard, in the US, we get quite a bit of coverage about Scotland and Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland is often for bad reasons, and depending on your view, in Scotland as well. We don't hear so much about Wales. So can you tell us a bit about sort of what's the political situation in Wales at the moment?
Yeah, we're well used to being overlooked, Alasdair. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes convincing you that Wales is by far the most interesting of all these places. And I should say also that when I'm going to talk about Wales, but I've also just published a book with Ailsa Henderson from Edinburgh on Englishness. So I've spent the last few years not only looking at Wales, but looking at England and Englishness, which is a big part of this story. And I think I'm going to start there, actually, because the point about Brexit is that, I mean, Alasdair described the UK as a unitary state. I'm not. Well, that's if it is a unitary state, it's a particularly complex, unusual unitary state. It's also a multinational state, and with complicated patterns of national identity across the state. And the point about Brexit, the starting point for considering the relationship between Brexit and devolution, is that attitudes to Brexit aligned with different senses of national identity in different parts of the UK. So in England, those people who felt English overwhelmingly voted to leave the European Union. Those people who felt British but not English voted to remain. Okay? And then in Scotland, those people with a strong sense of Scottish identity voted overwhelmingly to remain. But interestingly, attitudes that align with Englishness in England tend to align with Britishness, Scotland and in Wales. Okay? And then to add to the complication in Wales, we have around 20% of the electorate who feel English, people who've moved to Wales to retire. So in the Brexit referendum itself, even though Wales voted narrowly to leave the European Union, that kind of aggregate hides really deep divisions within Wales. So on the one hand, the English population in Wales voted like the English population in England, overwhelmingly to leave. Those people who felt Welsh only voted overwhelmingly to remain. Those people like me who speak Welsh, so Welsh is my first language, they were the most pro-Remain demographic group in Britain. So only 14%, 14% of Welsh speakers who feel Welsh voted to leave, okay? So you have this incredible, complicated demographic mix where attitudes to Brexit align with different senses of national identity and therefore different senses of who we are, where we've come from, where we fit into the world, where we might want to go. So what Brexit has done is then radically polarise things, because in Wales, until that point, the overwhelming majority opinion was pro-devolution. What we want is to be pretty autonomous, but within the UK. What Brexit has done is it's blown that out of the water, because Brexit is also being, the way that the UK government has interpreted Brexit is also to re-centralise power. So there's this increasing sense that devolution, that kind of autonomy, is unstable territory. And so what we've seen in Wales is polarisation, a very rapid growth of support for independence. There's been a very interesting kind of grassroots independence movement that has developed in Wales over the last 2.5 years. And the latest polling suggests somewhere around 1/3 of the voters in Wales would like Wales to become an independent country, which, by the way, is where it was in Scotland in early 2014. Okay, so that's not insignificant, and that's getting a lot of attention in the international media at the moment. But also, conversely, we're seeing the growth of, we were seeing until last week, the growth of a movement to abolish devolution, effectively to assimilate Wales fully into England in the way that it was in the 19th century. Again, I won't talk about the different histories of Wales, Scotland and Ireland, because we'll be here for hours if I do, but Wales was assimilated politically, has de-assimilated. There's now a movement to re-assimilate, to abolish the devolved structures, which leaves the Labour Party, which is the dominant party in Wales. You spoke, Alasdair, at the start of a centenary of Northern Ireland. Next year in Wales is the centenary of Labour dominance in Welsh politics. They've won every election in Wales since 1922, which is quite something in kind of democratic politics. And so what we have is this interesting, what Brexit has done is it's blown up this kind of consensus around devolution, and it means that kind of centre ground looks unstable. And the young people in particular are tending to look towards independence, and the support for independence amongst younger voters in Wales is very strong indeed. Older voters tend to cleave to more traditional ways, tend to be more supportive of diminishing or even getting rid of devolution. So it's really difficult to overestimate how much Brexit has changed the terms of constitutional debates in the UK. And I'll just finish with this. There's a kind of an irony about this, because 5 years ago we had we had a devolved election in Scotland and Wales last week. 5 years ago, it was held just a few weeks before the Brexit referendum. And interestingly, in both Scotland and in Wales, the Brexit referendum was completely overshadowed by the devolved elections, to the extent that there was actually very little campaigning on Brexit in Wales and Scotland. Then UK Prime Minister David Cameron was warned in a really unusual joint letter by the First Ministers of Scotland, Wales, and the First Minister and Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland. They wrote to David Cameron and said, please don't hold the Brexit referendum immediately after the devolved elections, because there won't be any campaigns. We've got other fish to fry. In his infinite wisdom, David Cameron did exactly that. He held a referendum. There were no campaigns really effectively in Scotland and Wales, or they were token campaigns. And yet, one of the huge impacts of Brexit is to ask really fundamental questions about the territorial integrity of a state. Because believe me, if Wales has got an independence movement, then the UK has got really serious problems. And I'll stop with that, Alasdair.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And that actually sets it up very nicely for that. I mean, so in both cases, in all three cases, we now have these centripetal forces politically, but Richard's comments also talked about the British government's interpretation of Brexit being a very centralizing one, and that's what I'd like to turn to now. So how has Brexit affected that relationship between the Welsh government and Westminster on the distribution of authority and powers?
Yeah, we've had we've just had really interesting elections in Wales, Scotland, and in England, actually. Did I freeze there? Sorry if we've had these very interesting elections, and they've been overshadowed by two things. One is the Constitution, and the second is COVID, obviously. I mean, we can't, obviously those of us who are interested in constitutional issues, we can talk for hours about Brexit and so on and so forth, but it's also important to note that COVID has been a background issue and is also having an impact on the Constitution. This is the interesting thing. COVID is also constitutional politics, because what we've seen in the UK over the last, since March, is that we've had the different governments of the UK. So the London government, which acts as the English government for many purposes, the Welsh government, the Scottish government, the Northern Ireland executive, they've all had a kind of significant role in dealing with the crisis, because they have extensive powers in relation to health, to education, and to all of these things, and to some of the regulations in terms of how people have been able to behave. And so what we've seen is that, and how can I put this diplomatically, especially because we have a diplomat listening in, the devolved governments have tended to be more cautious than the UK government acting in its English capacity. And the Welsh government has been heavily criticised by the Conservative Party in Wales for doing so. Basically, the message of the Conservative Party in Wales has been things have been done better in England, has been a not so crude summary of what they've been saying. And so the way that the Welsh government has dealt with COVID has become constitutionally charged, with the Conservative opposition in Wales saying, don't differ from England, do what they're doing. And Labour saying, well, actually, no, we think we should be more cautious. Plaid Cymru, which is the main nationalist party in Wales, being a kind of critical supporter of the Welsh Labour government. And so we've had this interesting dynamic. And the opinion polls that have been conducted have suggested that people have been first more aware of the way that the differences between the territories than ever before. People have been more aware of what devolved governments can do in Scotland and in Wales and in Northern Ireland than ever before. And people in Scotland And Wales, certainly, I don't know, David will know more about the Northern Ireland data than I do, but they preferred the cautious approach of the devolved governments. And so this has been kind of tested empirically last week, where we had this election where Labour managed yet again to win handsomely in Wales. The Conservatives underperformed their expectations, which were very high, and Plaid Cymru essentially was frustrated again because, in part, Welsh Labour was more small N nationalist. Basically, Welsh Labour's camped itself on a kind of soft nationalist ground. And so we have this quite extraordinary situation in Britain, so in Scotland, Wales and England, where we had three different parties winning the election. We've got three different dominant parties. The SNP is dominant in Scotland, as Megan was saying. The Conservatives are dominant in England. Labour is dominant in Wales. And interestingly, all three parties get majority support from the national identifiers in the different countries. So it's not only that the SNP is dominant in Scotland, it's dominant amongst those people who feel Scottish. In England, the Tories are dominant amongst people who feel English, and indeed, English identifiers have been flocking to Labour in recent general elections. In Wales, Labour does best amongst those people who feel Welsh. So you've got three different dominant national parties, which sets this up. This is kind of pregnant with all kinds of possibilities as a polity now, because you've got this incredible diversity, which is national diversity, which the state appears very poorly equipped to deal with. So that's where we are at the moment. Sorry, I can talk for hours about this, have on the media over the last week, so I should just stop and pass the ball on to somebody else, or else I'll just bore you all.
It's hardly boring. It's very, it's very interesting and very engagingly put. So, David, it's probably not top of mind, but how in Northern Ireland, but how has Brexit affected that relationship between the Northern Ireland government and London?
It's made it tenser, and it's increased levels of distrust quite considerably. I think Megan may say something similar about Scotland, but Brexit has always been felt as though it's something being done to Northern Ireland by the English. That Brexit is an English project and being pursued by a Conservative government, which is notionally conservative and unionist, but essentially being driven by an English agenda and the interests of English MPs. And on top of that, certainly from a Northern Ireland perspective, Brexit has been pursued without a real appreciation of the implications for Northern Ireland. We always knew that Brexit was going to be disruptive. It has to be by its nature. If you're leaving a major international organisation, your largest trading partner, leaving a single market, leaving a customs union, that is going to be disruptive. But the way in which it's been handled by the UK government, with a perceived lack of regard for the interests of Northern Ireland, has really undermined levels of trust within Northern Ireland. Now, levels of trust in the British government have never been particularly high amongst those who identify as nationalists, as Irish, but I think what's striking is the lack of trust there is now within unionists, within those who identify as British in the UK government. We did an opinion poll recently looking at attitudes towards trust in various bodies to do with Brexit. The level of trust in the UK government in Northern Ireland was 6%. 86% of people said they either did not trust or did not trust at all the UK government on Brexit. Quite striking figures. Not that people really trusted anybody except for business representatives, but and this is a real concern, because once you put that lack of trust onto the constitutional question I mentioned earlier, real concerns exist within unionism about the extent to which London, the UK government, the Conservative government, is really committed to Northern Ireland. And that level of trust is undermined further when one looks at the language, behaviour of the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, because he swore, well, I wouldn't say swore blind, but it was very, very clear that there would be no checks and controls in the Irish Sea on the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. There is now an Irish Sea border. That for many units, they are being cut off from the rest of the United Kingdom. And there is a sense of betrayal. We talk in Northern Ireland amongst unionists of a betrayal narrative. That Brexit has led to Northern Ireland's unionists being betrayed by the United Kingdom government. Now, I think the way in which Brexit has played out has demonstrated that there is an interest in trying to avoid the land border in Northern Ireland, return of a hard border, which was so crucial to the Troubles. But in many respects, that's come about not necessarily because of the UK government's policy, more, I think, because many nationalists would see the Irish government and the EU looking after their interests in this process. Okay, so this big issue is the whole question of trust. But on top of that, because there are these particular arrangements that have been put in place under the protocol for Northern Ireland, there's a sense of a bit of confusion about, like, well, who is actually responsible for running Northern Ireland now? For those who are supported Brexit, the fact that Northern Ireland remains in de facto the European Union's single market for goods, its customs union, and under the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice of the European Union, means that Brexit hasn't happened for them. That Northern Ireland now occupies this really strange position within the UK, but also partly within the European Union, which is unsettling. And the reason for this is because of the nature of the Brexit that the British government wanted to pursue, a British government which is essentially an English Conservative government. And it just reinforces this sense, as I said earlier, of distrust and uncertainty about what this will mean longer term for Northern Ireland. So yeah, highly disruptive, and certainly hasn't done any favours to the Belfast-London relationship, and quite some significant challenges there, I think, for the British government to try and manage over the coming years.
Thank you very much, David. All right, Megan, how's Holyrood getting on with Westminster?
Well, I probably will be mimicking many of the same points here: lack of trust, contention. Tensions, I would say, have probably been strained between the Scottish and Westminster governments for some time. But Brexit has essentially has been another triggering point that has really exacerbated those strains. And I think there's 2 points to bring out here with reference to Scotland in particular. So one is in terms of strain between the two governments. One of the strains is the fact that I think this probably goes for all of the devolved administrations, but particularly for Holyrood, is that the Brexit negotiations themselves, and then subsequently the UK-EU negotiations on the future relationship, have essentially been done without much input from the devolved administrations in the first place. And this is something that we're seeing now that the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement having come into force, such as it is. I mean, I think, Alasdair, your point was well made. It's highly light touch. Within that agreement, the Scottish Government has already been specifying the need for more meaningful Scottish representation in the agreement's governance structures. Now, the agreement's governance structures are already very light touch with reference to parliamentary oversight across the whole of the UK. But it's also limited in terms of deliberate Scottish engagement on those issues that are devolved. And that includes everything, things like justice and home affairs. There's areas where there's fisheries, for example. There are areas within that cooperation agreement which touch on devolved issues and where the Scottish Government does not feel like it is having a meaningful say. And that is a point of serious contention, and it's likely to only get worse if the UK Government doesn't open and allow the devolved administrations more access. Another caveat I'd also mention here is that the Scottish Government has already expressed its intentions to continue to align wherever possible with the EU on devolved matters. So we're seeing things on like environmental standards in education. I'm thinking, for example, about the Erasmus programme, for example, and on some certain matters of justice and affairs. Scottish Government wants to continue to find convergence and alignment with the European Union. So what we're likely to see, especially if the UK Government continues to try to find a way to separate from the EU, to not be conforming with various EU regulations and standards, is actually that the rest of the UK doesn't necessarily follow suit on devolved matters, and Scotland is already wanting to keep its alignment with the EU. Another point, though, I think there, and I'm sorry, forgive me, I've got my international politics hat on here, but one of the points of major tension in the relationship that I think is going to be more telling as we move on through this administration is that Brexit has essentially, I think, incentivized the Scottish Government under the SNP to continue pushing its devolved competencies further. It's sort of flexing its muscle within its own devolved competencies to see what it can do with reference to external relations. So under the last Scottish Government, the SNP administration, we were already starting to see this evidence. For example, in a reshuffle cabinet, there was this sort of newly created post of Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs. And this post was given responsibilities for Scotland's international relations, as well as in trade and development issues. Now, of course, these are reserved matters. Scotland doesn't actually have power to do anything on these issues. And yet, under the SNP, the Scottish Government has been pushing the boundaries just to see how far it can go within its devolved powers. And we're seeing this, if you look at the Scottish Civil Service, which has seen some reshuffling in recent years, where there's been a sort of groundswell of new staff moving into sort of an international division, many of whom I will mention have been flocking back from London to work for the Scottish Government instead, and where we're sort of seeing increasing work within the civil service on matters concerning Scotland's statecraft, like almost starting to ask the questions ahead of a potential independence, like what's Scotland's statecraft going to look like? Now, there's also been particular developments in more recent months, essentially leading up to the Scottish elections, which is why a point I mentioned about it probably being an ongoing tension and continued point of struggle between Edinburgh and London, is that just prior to the Scottish elections, the Scottish Government had launched various sort of reports, sort of a great flurry of activity, obviously, before Parliament shut down, where things like the government launched its new blueprint for Scotland's vision for trade. It also, in March, just literally before Parliament dissolved, it issued its report and recommendations for a Scotland-Ireland strategic review. Now, that was launched in 2019. It was launched because of Brexit, where it was about kind of consolidating Scotland-Ireland relations, mainly in devolved matters, but still it's this sort of evidence of a sort of the Scottish Government flexing its international muscle in those avenues that it can achieve it in devolved areas. And the SNP has made no secret of the fact, and it's in its 2021 manifesto, that it's committed to maintain and strengthen Scotland's relations with EU partners, with essentially with the idea of rejoining as soon as possible. It's also specified that it's going to create a new global affairs framework for Scotland. The SNP wants to scrap Trident, so we're going to see again this push, this contestation over whether or not Scotland wants nuclear weapons on Scottish soil, because at the moment, obviously, Trident is based at Faslane in Scotland. And it's also said that the SNP is going to pursue a feminist foreign policy. So again, we're sort of already seeing the SNP manoeuvring to create an SNP of a Scotland, really, let's take it up a level, a Scotland that is divergent and different in its international outlook relative to Westminster. And I think that that is going to be a really interesting point of development in how relations evolve. Because whilst the SNP has always sort of relied on a certain form of para-diplomacy in terms of its external relations, I think we're going to see more and more of it trying to do more with its European partners in particular, separate itself to sort of make it distinctive and different from the UK. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite Andrew Staunton to give his thoughts on what he's just heard.
Hi, there's a term in Scotland called "you've just received a hospital pass." Thank you very much, Alasdair, to try and comment on all of that. Just from the beginning, from me, just a couple of ground rules about who I am and what I represent. So obviously, Alasdair, when you invited me to speak today, the first thing I did was to check the date of the event. I saw it was after the 6th of May, and I thought, yes, it's not within Purda. I might be able to comment more. I looked at the theme, Brexit and the Disunited Kingdom. I thought, oh, that's a sparky title. That'll get the debate going. But then I thought to myself, well, the first thing I should say, Alasdair, is that I sit here as the representative of the United Kingdom. I'm not a political appointee. I'm not a politician. I'm a public servant, and I represent, the British government's views. But I do think I come at this with a degree of credibility. I've been practicing my accent all morning. So for those of you in America that can pick it up, I'm actually from Glasgow in Scotland. I've worked for the diplomatic service for 34 years, and I've been on 7 overseas postings. I've never lost my sense of identity. First of all, I'm from Glasgow. I'm rooted in Glasgow. I feel myself Scottish. I feel myself very British, and I also feel myself very European at different times. My job is about promoting the United Kingdom, but it's also really about promoting the constituent parts of the United Kingdom. So I can be equally proud to be Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish, or English. And before coming to my role in Atlanta, I travelled all across the United Kingdom because I wanted to be authentic, to discover what was happening in Leeds, what was happening in Manchester, what was happening in Swansea, what was happening in Cardiff. Because a big part of my role here is to promote the regions, the parts, the cities, the towns of the United Kingdom into the US. In fact, this morning I did an event with the Lochaber Chamber of Commerce. It's looking to establish better business links with the state of North Carolina. And I think that's an important point to bear in mind, that while there are big political debates out there, there is still that opportunity for the nations of the United Kingdom and that union of people to come together, to work together, because we do have very strong cultural, historical and economic ties that bind us together. But I am a big believer in knowing yourself and knowing your country. I also served for 4 years as the Deputy Ambassador in Ireland. So I did a lot of work on Northern Ireland, the Common Travel Area, the peace process, the prosperity process. And I've worked in the United States with representatives from the Scottish Government, the Northern Irish Government, the Welsh Government. And it's a pleasure to be joined today by Erica Stevens, representing the Welsh Government, and by Joni Smith from our embassy in DC, who's listening in, just to make sure I don't say anything that she fundamentally disagrees with. So I think that a big part of me is to show the success of devolution that started in 1997, but to show that the United Kingdom is here to promote the whole of the United Kingdom, to promote Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England. So that's a sort of starting point. Obviously, as Megan, David, and Richard have all set out much more eloquently than me, in fact, I wouldn't disagree with any of their analysis from a personal perspective, that these are the challenges and the issues that are out there and confront us. But the first thing, from the United Kingdom's perspective, our future path is no longer being part of the European Union. That is done and dusted in the legal sense. We did leave, I think, last year on the 31st of January 2020, and the transition period ended on the 1st of January. I travelled the southeast of the United States for 2.5 years, trying to interpret, give colour, give insight to what was happening on Brexit. There was a great deal of interest in what the UK outside of the single market might look like, what it would look like outside of the customs union, what this would mean for the Good Friday Agreement. And a big thing I heard across the US was, we need to ensure that you continue to trade with us, you continue to trade with the European Union, but that you also protect those aspects of peace and prosperity that have flowed from the Northern Ireland peace process. So no hard border. So the United Kingdom government obviously listened to all of those concerns. And we've also been looking obviously at the political tensions and the political movements within, as Richard quite eloquently put it, within Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England too. But to try and take this forward in a way where we strengthen the union. But it's clear that, you know, the elections of the 6th of May and the events in Northern Ireland in April and May and some of the issues around the Northern Ireland Protocol have all come together at a moment where politicians, analysts, foreign governments, businesses, investors, and people up and down the country going back into pubs for the first time about what does this all mean for the future of the United Kingdom. It's clear to me, as I said earlier, that we are a family of nations and a union of people that we think has worked for everyone. I mean, starting with Scotland, because Scotland does take up quite a lot of the airtime at this moment in time. I mean, it wouldn't come as a surprise to Megan to say that there's an interpretation of that pro-union versus pro-independence 50-50, as she would put it, or 55-45, as was shown in 2014. But there was a signal also given from the electorate that there was not an immediate path to independence and that the focus should be on COVID recovery, and that the full focus of governments at this moment in time should be directed with that energy, because, you know, analysts, even people in Scotland have appreciated that it will take more than a couple of years for the NHS in Scotland to recover. It will take more than a couple of years for Scottish businesses to recover. It will take more than a couple of years for the legal system to recover from the impacts of COVID. And the task at the moment for, as my Prime Minister would see it, for the rest of this Parliament is recovery. This will take time. So, you know, you will have heard Boris Johnson say that this is not the time to have hypothetical debates about the legitimacy of a referendum, or to get us into all-consuming discussions about constitutional issues when the world is recovering from a pandemic. I mean, you have made the point about there are certain areas that are still reserved under the devolution settlement, that there is not a right to independence, that 2014 did not give a right to an independence referendum in perpetuity, and there was no sign of a clear yes for independence at this moment in time. You know, so as a Scotsman, as a Glaswegian, I can see both sides of that coin. I can really understand where some of my friends, because I didn't have a vote in 2014 because I was not a resident of Scotland at that time, but some of my friends have taken one position and they've moved to another position. So Megan, you're really right to set out that there's that changing perspective that is happening at this moment in time. When or if the time for a referendum comes, it will be for the United Kingdom government to set out the benefits of remaining part of that union within the United Kingdom, as we did in 2014. And that, by 55-45, led to some of the aspects of that debate. You are right that Brexit hadn't come into being at that point, so that is a new factor that we'll have to take into account. On Northern Ireland, despite not being Irish, having lived there for 4 years and done the motorway between Dublin and Belfast on a monthly basis, and looked to instill not just north-south cooperation, but east-west cooperation. So yes, cooperation between Dublin and Belfast, but also between Dublin and London, Belfast and London, just to get that sense of that, taking the dividends of peace. Yes, the peace process remains fragile. Yes, there's still a degree of volatility. But the Northern Ireland people as a society, and David, this picks up one of your points about who's governing Northern Ireland. Under devolution, I think it's time for the Northern Ireland Executive to play a bigger role, a leadership role. You have power sharing arrangements that are back in place. We'll see what happens with after the election of the new DUP leader. But now the people of Northern Ireland need to be turning increasingly to ensuring that their politicians are the ones that are taking decisions. Yes, the settlement around the United Kingdom puts that into some difficult areas. The Northern Ireland Protocol was a unique solution to a set of the most complex challenges. There's no getting away from it. As I travelled the United States, everybody was telling me, no hard border, no hard border. Northern Ireland needs access to its biggest market, which is the United Kingdom, or the Great Britain part of the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It needs access to its markets in Ireland, but it also needs access to markets in the European Union. If it was easy to solve, we'd have done it in day one. The negotiations wouldn't have taken it. So there's been a compromise put in place. And I would actually say that there were two phases of the Brexit negotiations where the DUP was in the room in a very powerful position. And then there was that post-election period of when Boris Johnson delivered a majority of 83. But we couldn't get it resolved when the DUP had the power. And there are issues around that we need to think about. And I would say that some of the Northern Ireland Protocol issues, yes, go to the heart of sovereignty, yes, go to the heart of politics. But if you look at them, there's many of the operational aspects. It is a unique solution. It's just come into being. It's not perfect. Would either side want to rip it up and go back to the beginning? I'm not so sure. So we need to make this Northern Ireland Protocol work. There's been a better dialogue, it seems, between United Kingdom and EU negotiators since March. In order for the protocol to succeed, it must have the support of all communities within Northern Ireland. That sense of cross-community support is fundamental to the Good Friday Agreement. It's fundamental to issues around the border poll, as you mentioned earlier, and what would be the results of a border poll. So I think I would agree with you. And I mean, like Richard, I could talk about this for hours. Richard, I think you're right. I think it's right to bring into being that sense of English identity when we're looking at all of these aspects. I'm not a politician, but even just representing the UK overseas as I look at it, you're beginning to see the makeup of the Conservative Party, with more MPs elected in Labour stronglands of the north of the country. And also that sense of the levelling up agenda, or in the United States, you would call it that building back better agenda. But there's a real sense, and part of my mission here, I call it my Think South East mandate. So I want to get Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish and English companies to understand the opportunities that exist in the southeast of the United States. But a big part of what I'm trying to achieve is to get those companies from the southeast of the United States to understand that there's more to the United Kingdom than London and the southeast. And that plays into what we're trying to do with, the city deals, with the city growth strategies, with what's happening in Derry, Londonderry, with what's happening between Cardiff and Swansea. It's that sense of how do we ensure that there's opportunity for all across the United Kingdom. It might not have existed at all times, but certainly in the sense of levelling up, it might be a political strategy, but it's backed with huge infrastructure investments. And at the heart of it is about transforming the UK's economy. So there is that opportunity for all. So my final point as a diplomat, I can't really cover the politics in detail. I'd be more than happy to share a glass of wine, a scotch, a beer, a Guinness with any of you to hold court on what I firmly believe. But I think that the United Kingdom government wants the United Kingdom to succeed. Success for the United Kingdom doesn't just mean a strong England. It means a prosperous Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. And, I'll sort of leave it there. I'm more than happy to take any questions, but I have to say that the panel today, Megan, Richard and David, got to the heart of some of the most difficult issues facing the United Kingdom for generations. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We've heard a great deal. I would encourage the audience to send in some questions. We already have some, and I'm going to sort of picking up on ones that sort of play off what's been flagged already. So one One of them, and this is kind of a question for both David and Andrew, is from Michelle Egan, who's asking about what is the state of the Northern Ireland Protocol now, because we did have that period of quite extreme tension where it looked as though the British government was trying to unilaterally rewrite the agreement, and the EU initiated infringement proceedings. But Andrew made a reference that things seem to be being more constructive now. So what's sort of the state of play of trying to iron out these frictions within the Northern Ireland Protocol, which sort of triggered some of the unhappiness in Northern Ireland recently?
David, why don't you start?
Okay. Okay. A lot of tension around the protocol for sure, and yes, we had a really bumpy start to the year on this, such that eventually the EU did signal it was or notified that it would be taking legal action. I think there's a lot of focus now on institutional engagement. There's a lot of dialogue going on. There's a lot of work being done to try and identify the key issues which are proving problematic in its practical, technical implementation. And we're hoping to see some UK-EU agreement within the next 2 to 6 weeks. They're working on a number of documents, and actually David Frost, the UK lead on this, is currently before Parliament answering questions on it and trying to sound relatively upbeat. But there is nevertheless a big problem insofar as I would actually argue that the UK fundamentally underestimated the significance of what it had agreed in the protocol, and moreover did not seek to address some of the challenges through the type of agreement it concluded with the EU in the trading cooperation agreement last year. That there are going to be continued frictions on the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Moreover, those are likely to increase over the coming number of months, for the key reason being that there are a number of grace periods which are going to expire. And we're seeing lots of concerns being raised about what this might mean for the supply of some goods by supermarkets, what this might mean for medicines. So I think, okay, the situation has become slightly less political. There is engagement in trying to address these issues. The UK has now responded to the EU's legal action notice. We don't know the full detail of it. It came in last week. But I think that there is a genuine sense that both sides want to make the protocol work, because everybody's scratching their heads as to what the alternative might be. I think if there were a better alternative, it would have been found during the course of those negotiations. Nevertheless, they've still got to manage the politics in Northern Ireland around this, where unionists are vehemently opposed to it, particularly the new leader of the DUP. So yeah, some bumpy months ahead for sure.
Yes, Alasdair, just to add to David's point, I think there's been a mapping exercise carried out on what the frictions and the issues are. And it's clear that some look as though they can be satisfactorily resolved, but like all of these things, there are other aspects that look much more challenging. So there is dialogue, there is negotiation, there is debate. But David also mentioned that word about, or maybe he didn't mention it, so I'll mention it. It's the confidence amongst the communities and sort of that cross-community support. I think actions that were taken, I would say, by the European Union impacted on that confidence earlier this year, which was a regrettable thing. I think the United Kingdom is determined to stay in this dialogue, continue this mapping exercise, and try to come up with solutions. But the politics are not straightforward around it at this moment in time.
Right, thank you very much. This is a question I'm going to pose to Richard. And you talked about Englishness, and you sort of stressed how the sort of the emergence of de facto national parties in Scotland and Wales and in England. And the question from Francis Jacobs is, what portion of people in England, Scotland, and Wales define themselves as British? Because you sort of stressed who define themselves as the national group. And then what is their concept of Britishness?
Okay, that's a really great question, Francis. Thank you very much for it. So and this is going to be I'm going to start by being very academic, okay? It depends what you mean by British, okay? Because there are different ways of measuring, and I've spent a lot of time in the last few years looking at different survey measures of Britishness, etc., etc. But one very striking thing is that in the 2011 census, so there's a census every decade, and so we don't know the results of the most recent one, but in 2011, the last census, they asked for the first time people's sense of national identity. And the only place in the UK where Britishness was the plurality identity, that is, more people said they were British than anything else, is not even in Britain. It's in Northern Ireland. Okay? So not in England, Scotland or Wales is Britishness the plurality identity in the last census. So what that means is that English identity is stronger in England than British identity. Scotland, Wales, the same. Now, of course, that then, to add further complication, is that lots of people feel dual identity or nested identity is another. So in particular, lots of people who feel English also feel British. There are more people in Scotland who feel Scottish and not British. So these things are extremely complicated. It's also true, and this is something that the work that I've been involved in recently has shown very clearly, and something I alluded to earlier. It's also true that Britishness means different things in different parts of Britain. So the Britishness in East Belfast, okay, is different from the kind of cosmopolitan Britishness of black and ethnic minority communities in London. Okay, so attitudes to Europe, as I said, in England, anti-European sentiment aligns very closely with Englishness, but the same attitudes that align with Englishness in England vis-a-vis Europe align with Britishness in Scotland and in Wales. So this is an extremely, people tend to talk as if Britishness is this really straightforward thing. The UK is incredibly complex in terms of senses of national identity. And then, just because I can't help myself here, but just to add an addendum to David and Andrew. I mean, one of the things that's extraordinary about the UK in comparative terms is that, I mean, Andrew, fair play to him, and I'm sure he also means this, but, talks about this kind of strong sense of commitment to Britain and the Union. What's interesting is that if you look at public attitudes, you don't find that. So we did some polling after Brexit, which really shocked a lot of people. And I'm told authoritatively that it was put on Boris Johnson's desk when he took over as Prime Minister. Ailsa Henderson and I did some polling which showed that 85% of Conservative Leave voters in England thought that a second referendum in Scotland and a yes vote, a border poll in Northern Ireland and a vote for unity, that was a price worth paying for Brexit. So if they had to choose between Brexit and the territorial integrity of the state, 85% of those who vote for a party which calls itself the Conservative and Unionist Party chose Brexit over the territorial integrity of the state, which in comparative international terms blows people's minds. Okay? Actually, what we found in more recent work, which compares Scotland, England, Northern Ireland and Wales, is that in all four territories you find a majority for what we call ambiguous unionism. So basically, divide the electorate into three groups. Those people who say the union is all important, we'll do everything to keep it. That's group one. Group two is, we don't like the union, let's get rid of it, either through Irish unity, Scottish independence, Welsh independence, English independence. That's group two. Third group is, well, we kind of like the union, but if somebody wants to leave, that's okay, right? In every one of the 4 territories of the union, there's a majority composed of those people who say, let's end it now, or, well, if somebody wants to go, that's okay. Which, you know, when I talk to audiences in Canada or Spain or the US, people go, my gosh, that's extraordinary. That's really unusual. The territorial integrity of the state is not more highly valued than it is. But it speaks to the particular nature of the state, which is, you know, as I said right at the beginning of my remarks, it's a very unusual unitary state, which is probably not unitary at all, really. It's just this interesting historical agglomeration where the history still matters.
Alasdair, can I maybe just respond to that? I mean, just because I think this is very thought-provoking, and so I was thinking about it in my own circumstances, as Richard mentioned that pride thing. But this sense of identity, even within a small nuclear family like my own, I'm married to an English lady. I have 2 children. My daughter would not consider herself Scottish whatsoever. She would see herself as English and British, and my son would see himself as Scottish and English, depending on when it suited him. And then, you know, I have I'm an Irish immigrant family to Scotland, so I have a great affinity for Ireland. So I think that complexity of the mosaic of people's identity that's why it's difficult to have opinion polls that give you real clarity in that area. And one of the things that I should have touched on earlier, but I shall say it, as I was going around explaining Brexit to people, I often, because of my accent, the first question I would get would be, what do you think about the case for Scottish independence? Will there be another referendum? And this was during the Brexit negotiation process. I think there's an understanding, including in Scotland, including in other parts of the United Kingdom, that the complexity of the negotiations to leave the European Union would be nothing as opposed to the complexity of any post-independence negotiations between Scotland and the residual United Kingdom. And people are wanting for certainty at this moment in time. They want to understand economic consequences. They want to understand jobs, opportunity and growth. They want to understand recovery. And I'm just from myself thinking back to that discussion around Brexit, I think the uncertainty of that negotiating phase that would follow a second India referendum are very uppermost in people's thinking.
Can I just respond very, very quickly, Alasdair? I mean, I buy the point completely about complexity. You may be surprised to hear, audience, that I was born in Los Angeles, which so you know, there's a kind of you know, I get the personal biographies are complicated, but it's also true to say that the relationships between identity and positions on Brexit are very, very robust. They survive all contact with statistical modelling. And it's also very striking that we had national elections in Scotland, Wales and England last week, where the party that won in Scotland wants to end the union. The party that won in Wales says the union in its current form is dead. This is the actual position of the Labour Party in Wales. The union as it's currently formulated is dead. We need to completely change the union in ways that fundamentally recognise the sovereignty of Wales, Scotland, England, and all. You know, and then in England, obviously, another party won very handsomely and blew the Labour Party out of the water. So we're seeing in the ballot box behaviour which suggests that there are really profound differences across the state about the future.
All right, so I've got a challenge. So I've had a question waiting for Megan from the beginning, but there's one more question, which is kind of to all three of you, which is about how to fix this. But I'm going to leave that. I'm going to leave that one aside because it's an excellent closing question. So I'm going to ask Megan the question that Michelle Egan posed. So you made reference to the potential for tension within the UK internal market if Scotland chooses to continue to align with EU rules in areas of devolved power while the rest of the UK goes another way. So the question is, could you sort of elaborate on how extensive that might be? And then after that, maybe Richard could weigh in on whether or not there might be a similar move in Wales.
Sure, yeah. So I think it's probably too early to tell is the honest answer in terms of how extensive any divergence would be in terms of regulation standards across the UK relative to the EU. I don't even think the UK government knows how far it wants to diverge from the EU at this point. It really doesn't. I mean, it's caught between a rock and a hard place. It wants to be separate. It wants to do it differently for largely political reasons rather than for any that make economic sense. But I think I think some of the kind of hints that we're seeing from Scotland are in terms of particularly looking at environmental standards and on things like sustainable development, where sort of it wants to continue to be European. It wants to continue to wave the flag, but actually so does the rest of the UK. So whilst the rhetoric coming out of the SNP, the Scottish government, is very much a question of we're going to align with the EU wherever possible on devolved matters, in actual fact, the reality looks like we're going to see much of the same from the UK as well, because I don't think the UK the UK government has fully worked out yet how it can be different from the EU and yet still continue to do business with it. So I think, I'm sorry, it's a very vague, I don't know is essentially the answer, because we don't know yet. It's too early to tell, but David may have some insight from Northern Ireland.
Perhaps if I could come in quickly there, Alasdair. I think it's a big concern in Northern Ireland because under the protocol, Northern Ireland remains aligned with the European Union in the areas covered, so trading goods essentially. And that alignment is dynamic. So if the EU changes those regulations, Northern Ireland remains aligned. And the tensions that we're seeing within on the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, this Irish Sea border, are essentially due to the possibility of regulatory divergence. And it's interesting, there's a lot of support in Northern Ireland and also I think in the EU to reduce the checks and controls by a commitment to regulatory alignment. But the UK government, even though it's not spelt out the plans for regulatory divergence, is fundamentally opposed to that idea. So yeah, I think we're waiting here to find out what that regulatory divergence is going to be, because it's a major concern, say, for those unionists, because where we are at the moment is just the first stage of divergence, potentially, and things could get much more tense on that east-west border.
Just to follow up from David and Megan, we did some research on in the aftermath of the 2016 referendum about what people who voted for Brexit wanted in terms of divergence. And actually what was interesting is that people who voted for Brexit weren't expecting or not particularly wanting huge divergence. But the way that Brexit has been interpreted is that it has become a project that is focused on the principle of sovereignty and a particular vision of sovereignty, particular traditionalist vision of parliamentary sovereignty. And of course, that brings it into really fundamental conflict with devolution. Because, I mean, devolution for Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland is always different because it was related to a peace process and it's kind of sui generis reasons, and there's an international dimension to it and an international guarantee to it that doesn't apply in Scotland and Wales. But in Scotland and in Wales, it was seen as kind of an exercise in popular sovereignty, which gave it a legitimacy. And there was always a sense, and it was part of the debate in Scotland and Wales, is the UK is evolving away from parliamentary sovereignty to something else. And, so people talk about parliamentary sovereignty, but it's old-fashioned and it's the past. We all know it's evolving somewhere else. Suddenly Brexit comes along, and the way that Brexit is interpreted is in these maximalist parliamentary sovereignty terms. And suddenly, the story that we'd been telling ourselves in Cardiff or in Edinburgh, that just looks delusional, and so there's a real clash here, and it's got practical dimensions. It's about, what people can buy in supermarkets in Belfast, but it's also got high principle at stake. And do the mandates that were delivered for devolution really not matter anymore? The UK government just do what it wants in terms of recentralising power, overriding the devolution settlements, and so on and so forth. So there's a mixture of the pragmatic and the principled here in ways which weren't envisaged, I think, by many of the people who voted for Brexit 2016, but which are now playing out in ways that are, as both Megan and David said, are very difficult to predict. I don't think anybody knows where this is heading, because it's really quite combustible.
All right, great. We're sparking lots of questions. Some of them, I think, would be kind of challenging to answer. Well, all of them are challenging to answer. Some of them might be beyond the scope of expertise. But I'm going to posit one. This will be primarily to Richard, but I think David and Megan could weigh in as well. So it's from Martin Rhodes, asking whether the Conservative and Labour parties at the UK level are condemned to be English and are finished as UK political parties. Well, obviously, one might say yes in Scotland and with a different answer in Wales, but I'll let you.
That's such a good question. I think the Conservative Party is absolutely the dominant party in England. Labour's been the dominant party in Wales since 1922. In fact, the Conservatives last won a general election in Wales in 1859, I think it was. So the big question, I think, in terms of UK politics, or British politics rather, is can Labour come back in England? Which is a really, because it's very hard to envisage how a state which has got completely non-aligned politics in the four territories, in terms of the party political mix, in terms of preferences, how that has a long-term future. It's quite difficult to. I get all the issues about how difficult it would be to negotiate independence. All of this stuff I understand, but when you've got these fundamentally different preferences in place, I think it's very difficult. And so, lots of people would argue that the future of the Union in part depends on whether Labour makes a comeback in England. And at the moment, that looks very, very difficult. Labour is increasingly an urban, younger, more British party. People who feel English are not voting for Labour. In fact, they're moving away from Labour. Labour doesn't know what to do about that. It doesn't even recognise the problem, actually. As a centre-left party, it wants to understand things in socio-economic terms. Left behind. If there's a socio-economic explanation, you can have an economic task force, you can level up, you can do, But if it's fundamentally about identity and culture, that's really difficult for Labour. So that the centre-left in England is struggling. The centre-left is dominant in Scotland under the guise of the SNP, and is dominant in Wales through the Labour Party, and Plaid Cymru is also a centre-left party. England is dominated by the centre-right. So that is, and I genuinely don't know where Labour is going, and I'm not even convinced they've hit the bottom yet in terms of their current difficulties. Sorry, that's a complicated way of saying I don't know the answer to the question. It's a really good one.
Megan, you want to weigh on Labour in Scotland, or you happy?
Well, I kind of agree. I'd agree with Richard that Labour is sort of on the demise in Scotland as well, even though we've just had a new Labour leader just before the elections, but he didn't make much of a dent. And I have to say the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party in Scotland tends to try and wherever possible distance itself from Boris Johnson. So I did a rather good job of it under Ruth Davidson, who's now stepped down and actually is no longer an MSP. But yeah, so we have a very odd dynamic in Scotland where the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party is essentially the main opposition party and is sort of grown. In fact, a lot of tactical voting has seen a lot of support for it for the Conservatives in Scotland. But it is, I think, there is that sense of actually, there is a demise in terms of the same conservatism as in Scotland being the same as in England. They're not. They're very different parties.
Just add to that, Megan, what's interesting is you're absolutely right about Conservatives in Scotland. Labour in Wales differentiate themselves from Labour in England. They always use the modifier Welsh Labour, and they know that the polling suggests very strongly that makes them much more popular as a result. So, even these parties are actually nationally differentiated within the UK these days.
I've been a bad moderator because we've got a really big question. We have very little time, so this is going to be like a speed round, all right? This is from an audience member, David. It says, as an Englishman married to a Scot and living in Atlanta, I want to endorse Andrew's approach to integrate all of Britain to recognize the benefits of staying together during these polarized times. So to the rest of you, how might that happen? Yes, Richard said Labour needs to somehow come back in England.
If I may, I'm going to get it out of the way. I would say actually a lot of this has to come from the Westminster government. I think the David and Richard kind of hit on it with this whole sort of notion of centralisation under the Johnson administration, which needs to actually stop. And I think there's that kind of sense that when you're under threat, you tend to pull in the reins and hold the power closer. In actual fact, what we really need to see is more of letting the power go, so that the devolved administrations do feel like they are actually controlling their own destiny, as the SNP likes to refrain. They want to feel like they've got a say. They want to have a say in the EU, in ongoing EU negotiations. They want a voice, and unless you give it to them in a meaningful way, I think this is just going to become a kind of like a combustible situation that's just going to go, and we're going to end up essentially a kind of collective of small nations who have no say on the world stage. So I think, releasing some of the power to the devolved administrations is really the only way forward.
If I can, from a Northern Ireland perspective, I think Megan's right that the reason why you actually have support for you don't have unanimous or majority support for Northern Ireland joining Ireland is because for many people who would be soft nationalists, devolution can work. They seem to have got a deal was put in place in 1998, which allowed for Northern Ireland to look after a lot of its own affairs and have this unique situation perspective within Northern Ireland. I can't see Northern Ireland remaining part of the United Kingdom long term unless that arrangement continues to work, and that doesn't mean say that Northern Ireland has to be listened to. When the UK government talks about pursuing things in the interest of the whole of the United Kingdom, it does so in the interest of the whole of the United Kingdom, rather than being driven by what is increasingly likely to be a conservative English agenda.
Just would endorse that both what Megan and David have said very strongly, and I would just add the codicil really, just to draw attention to the audience that England is utterly dominant within the UK. It's 84% of the population, okay? So it's very, very easy for a UK government, which has to win a majority in England, to basically treat the UK as Greater England. And that is what has happened over the last few years. The UK government has treated the UK as Greater England, and from the different perspectives of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, it's seen as a voluntary association of kind of relatively equal partners. Now, the relatively equal has always been a myth, but because when you're 84% of the whole, Northern Ireland is 3%, we're 5%, Scotland is 7%. So England, but if you dismiss the pretense, if you just kind of ride roughshod, if you treat the UK as Greater England, which is what the UK government has been doing, then you're not going to keep the thing together. So you have to reverse that. And that's a real challenge for the UK government, and I see no sign at the moment that they're even recognising this.
Yes, Andrew.
Yeah, no, just to pick up on Megan's point about making devolution work, and I think David and Richard also touched on it, and releasing some of those powers. I think confidence is around what will the SNP still see as its ultimate destination when it gets these powers, in terms of that, where will that be sufficient? Will obviously be uppermost in the thinking of people who are looking at constitutional change moving forward. And just the other comment, I should have made it earlier, I've lived in 7 countries where I've analysed political situations around the world, and I've had at least 6 of them when a party was regarded as dead, and lo and behold, within 2 electoral cycles, it's now the dominant majority player. So, I think we have to look at, including within the US, you have to look at elections in sort of generational terms. And I think, many parties have come back, many dominant parties have fallen away. And there are different strains of support that do ebb and flow. I've been in countries where the Conservatives went down to 2% of the vote, and within 15 years they were the majority government. Again, in Canada, various reasons for that, but things do change along political continuum.
Great. So thank you very much. I think this has been all of you, Richard, Megan, David, and Andrew. This has been I've found it very illuminating. It was very lively. So thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. Thank you to Chris for running everything smoothly behind the scenes. And it was a great pleasure. I look forward to being able to have a wine, whiskey, or Guinness with you in person at some point. Thank you again very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.